Today on BRStv, we're going to demonstrate how to properly use BRS media reactors. These reactors are most commonly used for carbon and GFO, but can also be used for all sorts of medias.
The single reactor is going to be our most popular and can be used to run carbon or GFO individually, as well as together. Run individually, the reactor cartridge can hold enough media to maintain a tank as large as 120 to 150 gallons. Running them mixed is about half of that.
This isn't an exact figure because every aquarium has a different amount of livestock and food entering the system, but I agree with Reed. A single reactor filled with only carbon or GFO should be sufficient all the way up to at least a 120-gallon tank, and with both medias, around 60 gallons.
Filling the cartridge with GFO looks like this. Grab the BRS cartridge, remove both the cap and strainer. We don't need the foam pads for this, so you can set those aside. Then you want to add the appropriate amount of GFO to your cartridge, replace the strainer and the cap.
The process for carbon is similar. However, we don't want the carbon tumbling around because it's a bit softer material and will eventually grind itself to dust. So we're going to use these foam pads here to hold the carbon in place. Just approximate the amount you want to use and eye up where you want to put the foam pad. Pour in your carbon about an inch from the top, and then you want to tap the cartridge on the table a few times to get the particles to settle out. If needed, add a bit more carbon, add your second foam pad in to hold the carbon in place and assemble. The reason we pack the media at the top rather than the bottom of the cartridge is because the reactor's upflow design will hold the media more securely at the top. You might notice that while you're settling the cartridge out, there are a few particles that may have fallen to the bottom of the cartridge. These are really of no concern and not going anywhere.
To use GFO and carbon together, we are going to mix them. We suggest a mix of 2/3 carbon to 1/3 GFO. You can go up to 50-50 mix, but we don't suggest using more than 50% GFO because you run the risk of it clumping together. Make sure you get the two medias mixed well. The idea is we want the GFO particles to be separated from each other by the carbon particles to prevent the GFO from solidifying into large clumps and clogging the flow. Once mixed, you can go ahead and fill the cartridge the same way Ryan filled the carbon cartridge, using the foam pads to hold the media in place.
It is important that the medias are held in there securely with the foam pads because the GFO is a much harder material than the carbon, and if they're allowed to tumble around inside the cartridge vigorously, the GFO will eventually grind the carbon to dust. At this point, you might be asking yourself why everyone doesn't run GFO and carbon mix like this. Well, first, not every brand of reactor out there is capable of holding the media in place like this, so it doesn't grind up the carbon.
It's also not the most efficient way to use the medias. GFO can last considerably longer than the carbon, so when you change out the media, the GFO probably still has some life in it. However, mixing them is a lot easier and more convenient. Basically, it comes down to the media cost versus ease of use. The answer to that question will be different for everyone. Let's get a tank set up here and show everyone how to run a reactor.
You have two options. You can mount the entire system inside a cabinet or on the wall, or if you have space in your sump like this, you can shorten up the tubes a bit and then just set the whole thing down in your sump.
We're going to install them on the outside of the sump so you can see what is going on. The first step is to attach the pump to the end of the line using the push connect fitting that comes with your reactor. The most common pump for this will be a MaxiJet or Cobalt Aquatic's MJ1200. The Cobalt Aquatic's pump is the Italian-made MJ we have been using for years and what we recommend because it is quiet and reliable.
The newer MaxiJet had production moved to China, and I think the initial versions don't seem to be as quiet as the original Italian-made MJ. If you'd like to use a completely different pump or hard plumb the reactor, you can use a 1/2-inch push connect by 1/2-inch NPT connector like this one.
The first step to running any of these medias is rinsing out the dusty fines created in transport. With the pump in the tank, take the return hose and put it in a bucket of some kind. Now you can turn on the pump and let the water flush out all the dusty fines. We typically say until the water runs clear, which is often pretty quick, but I like to be sure and flush the media with at least a full gallon of water.
I agree, 1 gallon of water is a pretty good rule of thumb. Once you're done rinsing, place the return line back in the tank And with GFO, we're going to then adjust the valve to make sure the GFO is gently tumbling. Keep in mind the tumbling doesn't actually make it work any better, just prevents the GFO from solidifying into a solid brick that would clog the cartridge. We don't want it vigorously tumbling or it'll just create additional fines. Just enough so that all of the particles turn over a few times a day and don't adhere to each other. You should check it periodically and adjust the flow as needed.
The carbon is a lot easier. We don't want or need the carbon to tumble because tumbling won't make it function any better and will just create unnecessary fines. The foam pads we have here will hold the carbon in place. I normally just open the valve all the way and allow the flow to slow down over time as the cartridge slowly gets clogged with tank debris. As the carbon ages and becomes depleted, it requires longer contact time to be effective, so this natural reduction in flow rate works nicely.
The carbon and GFO mix is pretty much the same thing as running carbon. One of the nice things about running GFO this way is you don't have to be overly concerned with flow rates and perfect tumbling. This is the way I personally run GFO and carbon now, and for me the ease of use and lower maintenance is well worth a couple extra dollars in media.
We also have a dual reactor for larger aquariums, which allows you to run GFO in one chamber and carbon in the next. This takes up significantly less space than two single reactors, only requires one pump, and is less expensive than purchasing two singles. All these things make it pretty attractive, but adjusting the flow rates to tumble the GFO can be a bit more finicky because there's a lot of media in there and it can clog a lot easier.
You can keep both your single and dual reactors running better by keeping the tank debris out of the reactor with things like the MaxiJet pre-filter, which also fits cobalt MJs. Using filter socks on your overflow can also help keep debris out of your equipment, as well as make the tank look a lot nicer without all those small particles floating around.
We also sell a Deluxe Reactor. This model functions basically the same as a single, but has an integrated bracket, which makes it almost indestructible. Comes with some extra fittings for hose routing. It's a bit more compact and looks pretty sleek.
Last thing to go over is when to change the media out. This is going to depend on a lot of things, but generally we recommend using a small amount of carbon and changing it every 2 weeks when you do your other maintenance.
We recommend changing the GFO when you see phosphates rising or an increase in algae growth. This really depends mostly on the amount of GFO used, as well as the frequency and quantities of food added to the tank. This can be really anywhere between 2 and 8 weeks. Your best bet is to test the phosphates using a checker like this one and adjust the amount of media used to fit your feeding habits and maintenance schedule.
If you don't have anything to check your phosphate levels with, the second best option is to pay close attention to the algae growth in the tank. For example, if you find yourself needing to clean the glass an average of every 10 days, and now it's 7, that's a potential indicator that phosphate levels are rising, and you should adjust the amount of GFO used or the frequency that you replace it. Adjusting like this will help you maintain consistently low phosphate levels rather than allowing them to rise between media changes.
As for the mix, I try and create a mix that allows me to keep to my regular maintenance schedule, which is about every 2 weeks. I also change out the foam pads every couple of months once they lost their spring.
Well, that's it for today's episode. If you found it helpful, give us a thumbs up and subscribe.